There we go.
All right. I've shared my screen. Hopefully it's visible to everyone and you can also hear me. Please let me know if you can't. All right. So
Sounds good.
Yeah. So hi Deborah, and thanks for the kind introduction and also the invitation to speak here. And I'm very happy to give the first talk of this year. And so so our title is a bit of a mouthful. So I'll try to present it from the perspective of people who don't really work on all of these things and leave the detailed, uh, the details of what exactly was done to Jay. And as Deborah said, you can ask us questions and we're happy to answer. So let's begin. So before I get into the details, I do want to acknowledge our collaborators who, apart from Jay and I, have worked on this, and I've arranged them as grad students, postdocs, and faculty, and all of them have contributed to this work, and I'm speaking on behalf of all of them. So let's begin with an overview of what we are talking about. So as I probably don't need to introduce to this audience, one of the most remarkable predictions of general relativity is that binary systems radiate energy and angular momentum in the form of gravitational waves. And in the process, they get closer, so they in spiral and eventually merge if they are sufficiently compact and close together. And this sparked off in a quest to find these gravitational waves. And the most promising way of sensing them is by means of giant Michelson interferometers, which we call like LIGO and Virgo today, which are like examples of these. And they are sensing essentially the difference in the length between two arms in their L-shaped interferometers. And these arms are kilometer scale. And the most spectacular example of the detection is the one on the right, which is the first gravitational wave detection. And the two columns are showing the strain from the two LIGO interferometers which were operational at that time, the one at Hanford in Washington and the one at Livingston. So the top panels are showing the raw strain, so which is, remember, the difference in length between the arms, and the lower panel is showing the same data that is shown in the top, but in a slightly more intuitive visualization, which is commonly called a spectrogram, which is showing the frequency content as a function of time. And you can see this characteristic chirp, which is a signal of a gravitational wave event, that merger event that happened. And so this was what kicked off the progress in the field over the last 10 years. And of course, so that was in 2015, and now we are in 2024. So there has been a lot that has happened in the field since then, which is sort of nicely summarized in this slide from the LIGO collaboration, which is that showing how there have been a sequence of runs labeled by O1, O2, O3, O4, which is currently going on, and O5, which is planned. And these runs have seen a systematic improvement in sensitivity, which is shown by this range on the top, and I'll just mention in a bit how we understand that. And we are going from the era of individual detections to seeing a lot of these and trying to understand what what the population is. So just to expand on what I mean by the range, so if you take the raw gravitational wave strain data from one of the interferometers, so this is the data around 150914, so the strain is 3 orders of magnitude larger in amplitude than the actual gravitational wave signal itself. And so we have to model the noise in order to dig out the signals from underneath it. And the simplest model, which is sort of adequate but not correct all the way through, is that the noise is stationary and Gaussian, and in so in by that what I mean is that its statistical properties are completely described by what is called the autocorrelation function, and which is describing how the strain is related to itself as a function of lag. And equivalently, you can think of the Fourier transform of this autocorrelation function, which is the power spectral density, which roughly tells you how much noise is there as a function of frequency in the detector. And then you'll see curves like this, which are telling you roughly the RMS amplitude of the noise as a function of frequency. And you have this characteristic bucket-shaped sensitivity curve. And you can see that as the runs have been progressing from O1 to O2 to O3 and so on, so the curves are steadily going lower. So the noise amplitude is being reduced through many revolutionary sort of advancements in detector technology. And as a result, our ability to detect fainter events has been improving, and thus the range has been improving. Okay, so as I said, we are now, as a result of all of these improvements, we are going from the regime of individual, like wonderful detections to lots of them, which is, like you might have seen this plot at many points, which is like a way of visualizing the collection of detections that we have so far, where every detection has two masses that merge to form a final mass. So in this plot, there, it's showing the individual masses as circles, and then there's a circle that indicates the final mass. And it's very busy. There are a lot of things happening here. So for the purpose of this talk, let's focus on the blue circles, which are the binary black holes that we have seen in the LIGO detection so far. And the yellow ones and the red ones are like the existing detections from electromagnetic like signals, right? So not through gravitational waves, and the orange ones are neutron stars, which are also interesting in their own right, but I'm not going to focus on them in this talk. So this plot is like, while it is nice, it's only a visualization, right? Because we don't actually perfectly know the mass of every object in the in the mergers that we have seen, because we are actually seeing it under in like a wall of noise. So instead of get a bit more technical, you get some uncertainty. You have some uncertainties in the various parameters of the individual events. So which we quantify using, for example, a posterior distribution on their properties. So this plot is sort of collecting the posteriors of all of these events that I've shown in the previous plot. It's a bit messy because, of course, we don't know their masses exactly or the other properties exactly. So it becomes a blob, and therefore it's very busy. But it gives you a rough idea of where they all live, right? So on the x-axis in these plots, I've chosen to plot the source frame physical mass, so which is like the actual mass, intrinsic mass of, let's say, the primary component, which is like the heavier black hole. And then the top panel is showing the detections in the space of redshift versus the source frame mass. And the lower panel is showing the contours in the space of the mass ratio and the source frame mass. And right, so if you try to get a rough understanding of why do we see things in the place that we do see, so there are two curves that I kind of want to draw your eye to, which are the dashed curves in the upper panel. So the left dashed curve is the easier one to understand. So that is saying that if you take a merger with the same mass and keep moving it farther and farther away from you, so put it at a larger redshift, the signal becomes weaker. And there is some point where it goes below the noise amplitude, which is roughly shown by this dashed curve. So the constant I've chosen arbitrarily, so don't take it to be, don't take it very seriously, but it's roughly showing that we stop seeing things because the noise is becoming too large. And the right hand dashed curve is actually showing an effect of the shape of the power spectral density of the detectors, which is the bottom right plot, which you have seen before, except on top of that, you see a few actual signals, how they look like in the space of frequency. And so the signals that have been chosen in this plot are like the first detection, which is 150914, and then these subsequent two detections, 151012 and 151226. and that is a decreasing sequence in terms of mass. And so the signals get longer and longer on the top panel, and in the lower panel, the consequence of this in terms of how it looks like in the Fourier basis is that the heavier things, they start shifting to the left, right? And as you keep dialing up the mass, then what happens is at some point the curves move out of band because there is a wall of low frequency noise in the detector, and at that point you've lost your ability to detect it, and that roughly corresponds to upper cutoff in mass. So that is like the right dashed curve. Okay, so this is sort of governing why we see what we see. But of course, if you can't just take the observed events and make histograms and infer their properties, because we have a very heterogeneous selection. The two curves that I drew are only some simple examples of selection functions, and in reality, it's very heterogeneous. Right. So the way it's formally done is you have a population model. So you do it in the framework of Bayesian inference, where let's say you write down some model for how the mergers could be distributed in terms of their true parameters. In this case, I've written the spins, the masses, the mass ratio, and the distance, say. And then you try to do a forward model, right? So you take so it's a bit of a complicated equations, but I just want to sort of introduce the various terms to you. So you want to constrain the hyperparameters of this population model, which I've written as lambda. And then you write down a probability of seeing the catalog that you do see, right? And then the terms on the right-hand side, the first term, the prefactor is just the total expected length of the catalog, so to speak. And then for each term, then there's a product where each event contributes two terms. One term, which is which comes from the inevitable probability that the event is noise, and every event has this probability. And then the second term comes from the chance that it is real, right? And obviously we are hoping to get more events which are real. So so the first term is going to contribute the most, but there is still the second term. So now if we think of all of the components of this equation, the highlighted ones all depend on the search pipeline. So the probability that an event is real is what sometimes what you call the significance of the candidate, and that comes from empirically measuring the significance by means of injections or by doing whatever there are some ways to do that. And the prefactor, which is this expected length of the catalog, it comes from, again, injecting a large subset of events and trying to measure the dependence of how many you detect through doing this hypothetical experiment. And without these things, you cannot actually invert the observed detections and understand the true population of events. And by this process, essentially the collaboration and others have taken this catalog of events and then try to undo them to get at the underlying truth, right? So this is, for example, the distribution of the primary mass in all the events that we have seen and the mass ratio. And these posteriors are informing us about something about how these events could have been assembled. Okay, so this is the context. But now let's go back and revisit the plots that we see. And we see that, so there are these holes in these plots. And so now the question is, why do we have these features in this distribution? So there are, like two possibilities. One possibility is that really nature doesn't produce anything there, which is interesting. It tells you something. And the second possibility, which is also very likely, is that, for whatever reason, we didn't act, there are events there, we just haven't seen them. And this could be because of two reasons. So one reason is that we are just not sensitive at all to events in that parameter range, and that can happen. For example, if an event is super heavy, it would go so far to the right that it is just inconceivable that you detect it with the detector today. And the second reason, which is kind of motivating the talk that Jay is going to give, is that it can happen that because of various assumptions made in the search, we just lost the ability to find events there. And if we developed a better search, whatever that better might mean, we might find some things in that region. And I just want to emphasize that even if we don't develop this better search, right, ideally the injections that we do in the population analysis account for this effect. So it needn't be biased in principle. But of course, detecting things is always more informative than non-detecting them in not detecting them. So we would like to fix, this part B if we and give ourselves the best chance of understanding the true distribution. So to summarize, right, so there are some limitations in current searches which can indeed cause these holes. So, and a lot of these limitations come from, but not all of them, come from the fact that we adopt certain simplifying assumptions about what the signals actually could be in order to facilitate our search. And some of these things, which I will motivate in a bit, is that we even though general relativity tells us that signals have a rich structure, we sort of take the lowest approximation to facilitate our search. And as a result, we neglect phenomena like higher modes or the effect of precession of the orbit due to the spins. And as a result, we develop these holes in our search. And what is interesting is that these effects, even though they are not included in the search, you can take the loudest events and post facto look for them inside in these events at an individual level and also at the population level. And in fact, we have seen both these effects and thus it tells us that there is something that we could gain by actually looking for these effects. And okay, so I'll just since I'm running short of time, I'll just talk about higher harmonics and introduce what they are. So let's focus on quasi-circular binaries. So these are binaries that are shrinking but are instantaneously on circular orbits. So the simplest approximation for what the gravitational wave signal is that it is related to the so-called quadrupole moment of the mass distribution, which is some integral over the mass distribution. And from the fact that it is related to the quadrupole moment, we can immediately understand that the frequency of the gravitational wave signal should equal twice the instantaneous orbital frequency of the binary, right? But then the quadrupole is not the only multipole that describes these systems. There are also higher multipoles, which are described by L and M, which are the familiar spherical harmonic indices. And it turns out that the value of M is crucial for understanding what the observed frequency of these multipoles is in terms of the gravitational wave signal itself and how it is related to the underlying orbital frequency. And the fact that there are several multipoles implies that there are also several harmonics. So these are like overtones. And this is an example of these harmonics in the spectrogram of a noiseless signal. So, a signal with no noise, and just take the spectrogram and you see the dominant chirp, but you also see these ghostly chirps on top of the chirp, right, at higher frequencies. And these are the higher harmonics. And they are an inevitable prediction of general relativity, right? But they're not being included in the search. But an example of an event that does have these higher harmonics is GW190412, which is one of the first binary black holes that was detected. And this is the spectrogram of this harmonic. And you can see by eye, you can see the dominant harmonics chirp. But if you look at the track for this next harmonic, which is this dashed curve, it's not really visible by eye in this curve. But if you integrate the signal to noise ratio in that harmonic, so some over all frequencies, you get the curve on the left where the orange histogram is showing you for all the various posterior samples, they have some significant power in this higher harmonic, which is actually reflected in the signal to noise ratio that you see by integrating it against the data. And what information do you learn from it? So the first thing is that because you're just increasing the SNR, you will improve the overall significance of events. So the top panel on the right is showing how the harmonics look like now instead of the time frequency track, looking at the h of f itself. And you see the dominant harmonic is this blue curve, and then the subdominant harmonics are suppressed, but they're shifted to higher frequencies. So if this merger is in the right region of parameter space, there can be a substantial increase in the signal to noise ratio. And by ignoring them, you're sort of losing the signal to noise ratio that you could get. And this leads to a reduction in sensitive volume, which here is sketch is showing how it varies as a function of the masses of the system. And you can see that it's very heterogeneous across the parameter space. But moreover, apart from just detecting them, if you look at what governs the amplitude of these harmonics, so there is a term that depends on the mass ratio, and there is a term that depends on the inclination for just the dominant harmonic, the next harmonic. So if you measure this, you have better measurements of the mass ratio, which here is shown what for one of the events that happened in the first few runs, which is 17 or 729. And also remarkably, you get a better measurement of the orbital inclination because of the sine theta term, and you can break the degeneracy between inclination and distance, which is why many people are excited about using these harmonics to maybe improve the measurement of the Hubble constant. Right, so I'm out of time, so I will kind of skip the technical slides about how these searches work, but I will just leave you with one sort of important conclusion, which is that if you adopt the simple assumption that you can ignore these higher harmonics, it turns out that you can separate out all the angular parameters that describe the merger, and this massively reduces the parameter space that you have to search over. But then if you actually do want to include it in a naive way, it will massively increase the computational cost of any search. And hence you have to sort of abandon that or make some compromise. And what Jay is going to describe is a new algorithm that Jay and our group came up with to sort of get around this increase in computational cost and actually do the search, including this interesting piece of physics. And as a result, we not only found the existing events with in several cases with improved signal to noise ratios and significances, but we also found new candidates which span interesting regions in parameter space. And Jay is going to tell you all about that because I'm already kind of over time. So I'll end here. So thanks, and I guess wait for questions until the end of the talk.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Teja, for that excellent introduction. And yeah, let's hold off questions so that we can make sure that Jay has enough time to get through all of his content. So yeah, Jay, go ahead and take it away.
Can you answer? Yeah. Okay. Hey, so hi everybody. I'm Jay Wadekar. I'm a postdoc. I was a postdoc at the IIS in Princeton, and I recently moved a month ago to Johns Hopkins University. And I'll continue from the introduction that Teja mentioned. So as Teja mentioned already, excluding higher order modes reduces your sensitive volume, particularly in regions of asymmetric mass ratios and high masses. Okay, so why have they not been included in current searches? Is it because like the waveform models are not available? That's not the case, because now many waveform models like IMR family or the SEOB family do give you approximants which include these higher order modes. So they are available, but the challenge to include them in searches is data analysis one. And the most important thing that happens is like the size of the template bank increases by a large factor when you start to include these extra effects in your templates. And to show this, I'm showing a plot from a paper Harry et al. On the right. So here you can see these are the dots, and the crosses are the templates in the template bank that they have. If you only include the 2-2 mode, you can see there are much fewer crosses. But once you start including higher order modes, there are almost like the template bank size increases by a factor of nearly 50 to 100. And the reason for this is the size of template bank depends exponentially on the number of effective degrees of freedom in the templates. When you are only including the quadruple mode, you only have the masses of the two objects and the aligned spins. But then once you start including higher order modes, the things such as the inclination of the binary or the initial reference phase, those also you have to model in your template banks. And you can see that exponentially, if I start increasing number of parameters exponentially, my template bank starts growing. And to just think about it, what is happening is that when I change the inclination, actually the relative strength of the 3,3 to 2,2 changes, and so the addition of these two things looks a bit different. Or when I change the angle, there is a relative shift in the 2,2 and 3,3, so then that becomes a new template. And another thing that can happen, so once you have increased the number of templates, you can also get a large false alarm rate. And because you are increasing the freedom in your templates, you will get more background, and then that background will reduce your search sensitivity. So these two challenges were making this problem quite hard to include these higher order modes in searches, in a search pipeline, even though we have waveforms for those. So there were some people who tried to tackle this problem by brute force. So what they did was you narrow down your parameter space to a small region, and then you just brute force the compute into it. And the way some other groups have done is, so you have these three modes, or there are more you can have. What you do is you sample, say, an inclination and a reference phrase of the binary. You combine these modes in a particular way, and then you create a template bank like this. So in this template bank, for every 2,2 template, there are almost 100 of these higher mode templates. And what you do to collect your signal to noise ratio is you take an inner product of the data with all of these templates separately. And the crucial thing to mention here is that this inner product is a costly operation. So we would like to do it as fewer times as we can. And that's what we used as a trick to make this problem simpler. So what we do is, instead of taking the dot product of the data with these modes combined, you take the dot product of the data with these modes separately. You collect the signal to noise ratio time series for these modes separately, and then you combine them with different values of inclination or the reference phase of the binary, and you get your final signal to noise time series. So the important point to mention here is that earlier people paid this convolution cost 100 times because they had 100x number of templates, but now we have reduced down this cost to factor of 3 because we use 3 modes, and we only need to convert the data with these only these 3 modes. And to explain this with some few equations, you can see that the SNR, if you want to, so SNR is a dot product of the data with the full template, but then these modes, they are like linear combinations. The full template is a linear combination of these modes. So I can very simply just break up this inner product into these different linear combinations, and then I multiply. So these DH22 is the SNR time series of the 2,2 mode, same for the 3,3 and 4,4. And to include now inclination and reference phase, I just have to multiply these SNR time series by a scalar quantity and add them. And I can do that as many times as I want. That's a very cheap operation. And so this, first of all, helps us with reducing this cost from factor of 100 to factor of 3. And another way where this helps us is you can do a full marginalization integral over the inclination and the reference phase. So for example, we already know that the face-on objects, we should see them much more than the edge-on objects because the face-on things are brighter. So you can include that information in your integral when you combine this time series. And this is a non-trivial thing to do if you have already put this information in the templates, and you're match filtering these templates first of all with the data. So I think this is the crux of the advantage of using these mode by mode filtering, and that's how I think we made this problem much more tractable than it was before. Another thing that we worked on was reducing noise transients in gravitational wave data. I won't have a lot of time to talk about it because I have just 30 minutes. So if people want, they can ask me more questions later. But essentially, what is happening is that when you have long waveforms, they are very hard to get mimicked by these noise transients or glitches in the detector. But then if you have shorter waveforms, when you have high total masses, for example, I've shown here the result for 200 solar mass templates. They are so short that it looks like a blip, the real signal. And so then this can be mimicked by these noise transients quite a bit. And so then you can see the background in the detector is quite much higher for these shorter waveforms compared to longer. And so you are losing sensitivity in the high mass regime Because, for example, earlier you got a signal to noise ratio rho square 80 in an individual detector. For a longer waveform, that's a significant thing. It cannot be produced by background. But then the same thing can be produced by background quite a bit in the short waveform case. So we worked on some methods to improve this. If I have time, I'll get to this towards the end. So making these improvements of like including higher order modes in the template bank and reducing some of these non-Gaussian noise transients, we could find some interesting new signals. So in this plot, I've shown the contours that we got for some of the new events and also shown the contours for the previous events. So the gray plots were what Teja was also showing in his slide. And I've superimposed the new things that we found. I've put them in colors, their contours. So the colors represent the probability of these new candidate events that we found to be of astrophysical origin. So which means that like the contours which are red, say 0.5 has like an equal chance of being a real event versus a noise transient, versus something that is green has a better chance of being a real signal compared to noise. And in this plot, like you can notice there are almost like 13 new contours that we show. So like we found 13 new candidate events. And one thing I should also mention is that the false alarm rate of these events is not very low. So which means that they are not super significant. Like you can see the best one we have is like 0.9 versus like some of the most confident LBK detections are like 0.999 and above. And the reason for this is just like we actually specifically went after these near threshold or sub threshold near threshold events or candidates that you call, because if something was super loud, already the earlier pipelines would have detected that. So improving having this extra sensitivity due to higher order modes when there are events which are like sub threshold, for example, some event which is at a much farther distance at high redshift, that was just on the brink of whether it can be sensitively detected in your pipeline or not. Including this higher order mode information can make it cross that bar, and now we can detect it. So most of these are like near threshold ones, and some interesting things to like quickly see here is just that there are a lot of these things at high masses and high redshifts. As Teja mentioned, like the importance of higher order modes becomes more for these specific ranges. Okay, so then connecting this back to astrophysics. So why is this important? Finding these black holes at high masses. So from the stellar evolution theory, we know that when stars are beyond a certain mass, you have pair production in their centers, which can actually trigger an explosive oxygen ignition and can completely dissociate the full star without leaving any remnant. So there for black holes to form, like from the stellar collapse alone, like there seems to be a range in which these black holes, it's hard for stellar collapse to form black holes in a particular range, and that range roughly is within like 50 and 150. These boundaries are not exactly known, but people like everyone believes that there is some range where these things cannot form. And so if you find empirically things in this regime, it is quite interesting, because they could have formed from other channels, like hierarchical mergers from globular clusters. And the other side is the IMBH regime, or the intermediate mass black hole regime. So here, I mean, there have been decades of astrophysics, like astrophysical observations trying to find black holes in this IMBH regime, but there is currently no candidate which is confident, other than the one found from GW, which is this 1905-21. And we want to find more of these because the formation mechanisms of these things are very unknown. Like they could have formed from POP3 stars, primordial black holes, AGN disks. We don't know anything currently. So having more detections in this regime is important. And I think that's why some of these events, even though they are like not very confident, they are still important, because once you add them to your population analysis, they can tell you in certain regimes, like whether you are like detecting some of these black holes in a particular mass regime, and then you can infer things about the parent mass gap or the IMBH regime from this. And so here I'm just showing again this pair instability mass gap contours. And two events I would like to highlight from this higher mode search. So first of all, like there were from the higher mode search, you don't just get new things, you can also improve the significance of older things. And this was the case for this particular event. I've shown it in gray because it was not a new detection in our case, it was already detected in a previous paper. But then the false alarm rate improved by a factor of 20 once you included higher order modes, because this event got more signal to noise ratio in higher order modes. So that's why also these higher order modes are important. And another thing is this IMBH regime. So there is a tentative candidate. I would not call this confident candidate, but a tentative candidate. But nevertheless, you can see that the signal to noise ratio square for this candidate, when you only include the quadruple mode, it is only 10 versus it goes to like 12 when you include higher order modes. So these higher order modes are important to bring some of these candidates from below significance to above significance. Okay, then other than the masses and the redshifts, one other interesting thing about like black holes is their spins of the black hole binaries. And why they are interesting is because like we want to also understand what are the formation channels of these black holes. Do they form in field channel where you have these individual stars and then you have black holes which can get spin up by accretion, and so their spins will point in the same direction as their orbital angular momentum. Versus in the other case, you have a cluster formation scenario where the spins can be any way around, like these black holes are meeting at the centers of clusters. So the spins can be misaligned by any, can be in any direction. And so if you measure the spins or the measure the component of the spins along the orbital angular momentum, you can disentangle these channels. So let's look at what this chi effective parameter shows us for the old and the new events. So again, I've again colored the new ones in these colored labels, and the old ones are the gray. And so from this plot, so the chi effective is the component of the spin along the orbital angular momentum, which means that one means like they are exactly aligned with the orbital angular momentum and highly spinning, versus z, and zero means they are misaligned. So from this plot, I mean, by eye, you will maybe notice that there seems to be an additional number of things which are high, of the positive chi effective value. But we are currently also then investigating whether this is really the case. Like does the universe really prefer these positive chi effective values, or is this just because of our selection effects? Like black holes here we are more sensitive to black holes with positive chi effects than negative, and so we are now trying to do a population analysis, including these new things and seeing whether this is a physical effect or just a selection effect of our search. Okay, and then another dimension for these new tentatively new detections is the mass ratio space. So higher order modes, they have more SNR when you have more asymmetric black hole binaries. So I mean, this was actually the primary reason for our search. As Teja mentioned, there are these holes from previous detections where you do not see many things at these low mass ratio things. So we thought like including higher order modes, maybe we will be able to see confident ones in this low Q regime. But you can see that even though there are some tentative things, they are not very confident. So it seems like, I mean, in the universe, there are not like not many of these more extreme mass ratio binaries. And one another important thing to mention is that, so including these higher order modes is even if you don't detect some events in a particular regime, if you are more sensitive to this regime, you can better constrain your population analysis, because I mean, earlier we were not sensitive to this regime and we did not detect it. So that just means like there could have been things here. But now that we are more sensitive and we don't detect them, we can constrain this population regime more strongly. Okay. So let me then talk about some other applications that we are working on of this mode by mode filtering approach, where we are taking this dot product of the data with these modes separately. So we included these higher order modes in the pipeline, and we did our search limited to mass ratio Q greater than 1/18 in the study that are in the plot that I've shown. But now we are actually trying to push for things even with a more extreme mass ratio, say going below 1/18. So something with 1/50 or 1/100 or 1/200. And here the importance of higher order modes is even more. As you can see in this plot, the red color shows that like you are losing a lot of volume if you do not include these higher order modes. And so you're missing like say 60% of the systems in this regime if you do not include higher order modes. So we are specifically like trying to look for things in this regime. I mean, finding even a few things here, it would be quite interesting. So that's why we are going after this regime, and stay tuned. I think we are almost finishing the search. So in O3A, we did not find anything. I think so. O3B, we are currently finishing, and so we'll put out the results from this soon. Another important offshoot of this data analysis method that we developed is for low latency searches. So currently in low latency, for the low latency things, we use Baystar, where in Baystar we only use this 2-2 or the quadruple mode. And Teja mentioned that there is this well-known degeneracy that if you do not have higher order modes, you have the distance inclination degeneracy. So you cannot estimate the distance very well. And so this can make it hard for people using telescopes to like locate this event in their catalogs. And so when you have higher order modes, for example, like that can improve your distance estimates. And so it is to have a quick way of releasing these better distance estimates, you should be able to include higher order modes in your this Baystar like pipeline. And so this method that we developed of like using these 3 different time series that can be easily applied to Baystar like methods, and we can improve, we can give out like better posteriors for these NSBH like events. So that is another way where this method can be useful. And then other things I should mention about searches. So Teja mentioned that currently almost all pipelines only include the quadruple mode. Other approximation that almost all pipelines and our pipeline make is that the spins are aligned with the orbit. But when there is a possibility of spins being misaligned, and we have seen this in real events. So again, there is an increase in the parameter space. So for example, in higher order modes, you went from these intrinsic parameters to inclination and the reference orbital phase. And for when you want to include precession, you have to also then think of these spin components being aligned with the binary, and that introduces like more parameters. And as I mentioned earlier, the size of the template bank is exponentially sensitive to the number of effective parameters. So if you want to include these extra degrees of freedom, it becomes hard to do the search. And also for eccentricity, other than these intrinsic parameters, we also want to include two additional parameters, the eccentricity of the binary and the mean anomaly. And then again, it's an exponentially sensitive thing. The template bank will start to explode. And so I think this method of like doing this mode by mode filtering is also applicable for these cases. So this we have not done, but this is just a sketch of trying to like motivate that this method can also be useful for other stuff, this precession and eccentricity. And the trick would be now we were doing the data analysis with these 2-2 and higher order modes. We were doing the inner product separately. In the eccentric and the precessing cases, all you have to do is decompose your waveform into these eccentricity harmonics or like precession harmonics, and then do your match filtering with them separately, and then combine these things with these coefficients which encode the value of eccentricity and mean anomaly or the precession angles, for example. And so this makes the search like much more tractable. So for example, like to do these brute force searches, this precession and eccentricity, these people had to use like 100x more templates in their template bank. But if you follow these approaches, you can do it in a few x computational cost. So that's why I thought like just giving an overview of these method and its connections to other cases also would be useful. Okay, so I don't know how I'm on. Okay, I think I'm running out of time a bit. So I'll mention like in the last few slides some of the work that we are doing. So one of the important things left to do is quantify the selection function of our search. And we are planning to use the injections from the LVK to do this, so people can have apples to apples comparison between our pipeline and the other pipelines in the literature. And then we also plan to do population analysis to try to disentangle what is the, like, how is the mass function of black holes in this very heavy mass range where we could see a change due to these extra events due to higher order modes. Other thing I should mention is, like, we recover most of the previously detected signals, but not all of them. I mean, there have been some cases where we have vetoed certain precessing high significance black hole candidates, and we are also working on, like, improving that. We are working on, like, fine tuning our veto to not have this behavior. Other things we are planning to do is using normalizing flows to model the space of higher mode parameter that we use, and then also use, like, machine learning based glitch reduction. I have a slide on that if we have time. And one last thing to just mention is that we only used Hanford and Livingston in our search, did not use Virgo. It would be good to also have the Virgo in our search. Okay, and then my last slide is just a motivator of why machine learning can be useful in searches. So there has been a lot of interest in using machine learning for different kinds of GW analysis, parameter estimation, but also in searches it also can be a very useful tool. So as I mentioned earlier, the high mass black holes are contaminated by these background glitches, and so one thing that everybody does is when you see a signal to noise time series, you're only inferring things localized to the event. But then if there is, like, say the detector is behaving weirdly in an extended region in time space, so like an extended time frequency spectrogram, you can see that in this case the signal is at very close to t equal to 0 in this plot, but then there is this junk at other times. And so these things, it's hard to model how should you, like, interpret the significance of this when you have additional triggers. And so having a model independent method like machine learning tools can be useful in this case, and we are also planning to, like, work on that, and that will even more improve the sensitivity to high mass black holes. Okay, so let me just summarize, because I think we are reaching I'm reaching the end of the time. So in the first part I showed that there is an efficient method of introducing higher order harmonics in a gravitational wave search pipeline. So a brute force method will need 100x the computational power, but if you use an effective method like this, where you decouple these harmonics and match filter them separately, you can be done in 3 times more the cost. And then I also showed that we searched in the O3A and O3B data, and we found interesting mergers with interesting properties like high masses, high redshifts. And this methodology will be important for next generation surveys, especially like the unequal mass ratio systems in different surveys. Like, for example, the EMBRIs or the IMBRIs are a big science case in LISA, and these using, like, higher order modes are very important for those systems. And the last point is just that we recently made our pipeline publicly available. So if people are interested in using it or comparing it with other pipelines, they can feel free. We have also some tutorial notebooks. And I should also mention this property of, like, decomposing harmonics, decomposing the wavelength into the waveform into harmonics and separate searching for these separately. I mean, I think that can be applied to other pipelines as well. Like, it's not something specialized for the IAS pipeline that I'm showing these results for. Like, it could be included in different pipelines with different methods of making template banks. And so I think it's a general method, not just, like, tailored to a particular pipeline, and people can use it for other kinds of searches. So I think I'll stop here.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, both Teja and Jay, for that excellent talk. Seems like really exciting work. All right, let's go ahead and open it up to questions. If the audience has any questions they'd like to ask. Trying to keep an eye out for hands up and things in the chat. Well, while we wait for people to chime in, I was just wondering, so you've talked about, other methods of including higher order harmonics are much more expensive because you have to optimize over all of these more parameters and you have so much more search thing. So obviously this method is a lot faster than that. Have you done a direct comparison of how like accurate it is compared to those methods in terms of like what you discover and if they, you know, yield equivalent results?
Yes, so we have done what you call an effectualness test. So you make a waveform including all the different harmonics, and then you use this template bank and this mode by mode filtering method and see if you recover the SNR. So you do this on injections, and we see that we are recovering injections, the SNR to a good extent. So we recovered like say 95, more than 95% of the SNR in more than 99% of the waveforms. So we did that test, but now we are doing this test on injections, running the injections through the pipeline entirely. And that will be a more strict test of whether this pipeline is functioning properly, and these higher order modes are indeed giving like additional information compared to the 2.2, and we are not reducing sensitivity in some way. So I hope
Great,
that
very
answers
cool.
it.
Yeah, no, that definitely answered it. All right, I see that Gabriela has her hand up. Do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask?
Yes, hi, this is very nice work. Thank you. I see that all the gray dots, if I understand right, are events that were already found by LBK. So I was wondering whether you recover them with similar parameters than in the LBK catalog, whether there's a bias towards higher masses because you use the higher harmonics. Do you have any information on that?
So
Yeah, go ahead.
maybe I can answer. So even though the LVK's search pipelines, at least the modeled ones, include only the quadrupole, once an event is found, the parameter estimation is done with the full waveform model, including all these effects. So once an event is found, I don't think we say anything different about it than what the other pipelines say. It's more about like giving ourselves the chance to find the fainter cousins of these events. If that makes sense.
Yes, it's good to see. So that shows that there is no
And in terms of recovering the events themselves, yes. So we do recover the events, and in several cases with slightly higher SNR because you are including this extra physics in the search. But the mapping of the SNR to significance is non-trivial, and that is what all the population and the injection work is doing. Right. Yeah.
Thank you. Again, this is very interesting work, and it's nice to see new and interesting events. Thank you.
There's also a question in the chat.
Yep. If you want to go ahead and just, or I can read it out loud real quick. You said that the use of higher harmonics helps to determine the Hubble constant to higher precision. Could you explain this, please, in more detail? Thank you.
I think Teja's slide might be better.
Okay. I mean, I can just say it in words. So the point is that when you detect an event, you're trying to ask in what are its parameters, and you get these posteriors. And these posteriors are obtained using a waveform model. So if you use the waveform model that contain only the dominant harmonic, there is a degeneracy between the distance and the inclination. And for example, if you take mergers that have an electromagnetic counterpart, then let's say you have a counterpart with a redshift, and then from the gravitational wave data, you want the distance so that you can do the Hubble constant measurement. You cannot tell the distance to a good precision because it's degenerate with the inclination. But if you can measure these harmonics, they break this degeneracy to an extent, and then you get tighter posteriors on the distance. And therefore, this will translate into a better measurement on the Hubble. So I think maybe like pictures are better than words. So maybe let me just show them. I showed it in the talk, but I can show it again. Oops, sorry, lots of slides. Yeah, so this figure on the left panel shows this. So this is for 1904-12, which is one of the events that has seen, like, you see these higher harmonics very significantly. And the blue contour in the space of distance versus theta jn, which is the inclination, it allows a much larger range of distances than the orange one does, because like you don't know the inclination very well. But then once you see these higher harmonics, they help pin down the inclination to an extent, which then helps to narrow down the distance posterior. Does this help? Unless you had a more specific question.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. I had a quick question just while you're on that slide. Just noticing that the higher harmonics, so in that top right plot, the blue is the 2-2 mode, and then you've got the 3-3 and the 4-4 mode. Just naively looking at that plot, those higher harmonics almost look like they could just be BBH signals in and of themselves, just that are of like lower mass. When thinking about, next generation detectors, and when we have like overlapping signals and things like that, I just wonder how this could come into play with confusion of overlapping signals.
Yeah, so I don't particularly get why this is unique to overlapping signals, but even for an individual signal, you're right that if you detect only one of these harmonics, then, and if then you don't know which harmonic it is, then you can have a very broad posterior. But in practice, you typically detect the dominant one and the subdominant ones. So this helps break the degeneracy, unless there is some weird configuration where you can hide the dominant harmonic. So
if it were like too high mass, yeah.
Yes. So I think I was asked this question a few times, like, for example, if you take this, 1905-21, can you cook up a situation where it's actually, that you're seeing the higher harmonic? And I admit I didn't try very hard, but the simple thing I tried didn't work out. So, because, like the shape of the noise curve is not quite what is needed to hide that.
Gotcha. That is interesting, though. That's a very interesting question.
1000 solar mass thing, I'm pretty sure that you wouldn't miss completely the 2-2, but you will see some of the higher harmonics in current, even in the current detector.
Sure. All right, great. Well, we're at the top of the hour, so I think we should probably call it there. I want to thank our speakers again for that excellent talk, and thank you all of you guys for attending. And I just want to remind everybody that we do these talks on the first Thursday of every month. So our next one is on November 7th, and it'll be Jocelyn Reed and Lami Suleiman. So look forward to seeing you all again in a month. Thank you again.
Thanks for having us.